Hello and welcome back. We have someone that's brilliant, in my opinion. I mean, not only does he talk about something I have no idea about, but he's one of our brilliant people at FreightWaves. We have our very own Matt Blois. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, guys.
Good to have you back again, Matt, talking all things, of course, medical supply chain for us. First things first, give us a little bit of a sneak peek. What's going on this week in your Medically Necessary newsletter?
So this week, I've been working on a couple stories about decentralized clinical trials. Basically, during the pandemic, a lot of clinical trials had to switch from this really site-based model where patients kind of go to a research site, get tests done, get medications, and then so all of the medications and everything you would need for the trial goes to that site. But a lot of them over the pandemic became decentralized, so you're shipping things to patients' homes, or you're just doing a lot of that research in the patient's home. So I've been writing about sort of the logistics of that and how the industry's been responding to that. That's one of the big things I'm going to be writing about this week.
So, Matt, speaking of industry responses, we have to talk about one of those big ones, and that's going to be the one with mask makers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I thought I wrote this story last week. I've been seeing this. There's basically this group of mask makers. They call themselves the American Association of Mask Makers, AMA. Um, and they've been putting out these warning letters for the last couple of weeks saying that they're getting really close to having a lot of their members shut down. And that's basically because there's not as much demand for masks anymore. And a lot of these companies are pretty small. I talked to three different members, and most of them were people that had started their companies during the pandemic as a response to what was happening, and now they're in pretty serious trouble. Just not much demand. Hospitals have kind of restocked, and they're just having trouble selling their masks.
So that seems kind of like a classic supply and demand issue, right? And, of course, masks in the United States were a political issue when I don't necessarily think that they really should have been a political issue. And now that we're seeing the Delta variant spread across the United States, we're seeing this kind of recommendation that even fully vaccinated adults should start masking again as kind of a courtesy or even just a protection against those who aren't vaccinated. Do you see that as the Delta variant of COVID continues to spread, do you think that that will throw any support behind these mask makers, or is it more kind of just people are done masking overall, and so they're just not going to have any of this support at all?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I did talk to one of the people I talked to said that they felt like they saw a slight uptick when I think it was WHO started recommending people wear masks because of the Delta variant, and then also I think it was Los Angeles County changed some of their masking rules too, and so he was pointing to that as something that maybe caused a slight uptick. Um, but I mean, vaccination continues, and the big thing is the places that are buying large quantities of these masks aren't like individual consumers. It's places like hospitals or governments. And when you look at like the strategic national stockpile has already met its goal in terms of stocking up on N95 masks. And a lot of the hospitals are reporting that they've got a lot of inventory of masks, sometimes years of inventory of masks. So those buyers aren't probably going to come back to buy a ton of masks because they've got pretty big stockpiles of them already.
And so, Matt, I've seen a couple of reports of colleges, universities, and even some lower schools either saying, hey, to come back to our campus, you're either going to have to be vaccinated or have to wear a mask. Do you see any indication of any of these schools or universities maybe throwing some support in purchasing wholesale or larger orders of masks in order to say, like, you know what, we're going to give you one, but, we really prefer that you're vaccinated instead?
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting question. I didn't talk to any schools, and the AMA members that I talked to, that wasn't sort of a solution that they threw out there. They were looking more for orders from the federal government was kind of their big aim. Um, but I mean that feels like a place that definitely could make a difference. I mean, there's a lot of students in the United States, and so if you bought masks for a lot of those students, that would definitely feel like in my opinion, I feel like that would move the needle.
So, Matt, another area potentially. So, we are recovering very nicely in the US, but not so much in other parts of the country. Do you see that there's any type of opportunity overseas or in other countries that aren't dealing as well for these masks?
Yeah, well, and that's one that I talked to the chairman of the Mask Makers Association, and he was saying one thing he would like to see is he'd love to see USAID, the International Aid Organization, within the U.S. federal government. He'd love to see them buy U.S. masks and just sort of distribute them because we're donating all these vaccines, and he's saying why can't we just buy a bunch of American masks and send out those masks with the vaccines as well, which I thought was an interesting idea. And one of the things I reached out to USAID about this idea to ask what's feasible about that, and I found out a couple of interesting things. One of the interesting things is over the last year or so, for most of 2020. Organizations that partnered with USAID actually were directed not to buy American masks. That's because they're doing these programs overseas, and there's a FEMA rule that was basically trying to preserve the PPE supply within the United States, make sure that supply is secure for domestic use. And then that rule expired at the end of April. And so they switched from not being able to buy masks at all. Well, in most cases, to being, having a little bit more freedom. I think the trick there is just how government contracting works, because, the government has to send out a proposal and say, hey, companies bid on this. And so it's just a little bit more complicated when the federal government's buying things like that. But that is something that the mask makers have pointed to, and at least the rule that was preventing that has expired. So there's some potential there.
Interesting stuff there. Matt, thank you so much for joining us this morning on FreightWaves Now. Go catch his show, Medically Necessary, that comes out on Thursday afternoons. This week is going to be a good one. It's the second one to a two-parter, and so if you missed the first episode, go watch it up on FreightWaves.com.